What if everything you thought you knew about one of history's most famous encounters was wrong? What if the creature that changed the course of human civilization wasn't what it appeared to be at all? Today, we're diving into forbidden history to uncover the untold story of the serpent in Eden. A tale that goes far deeper than Sunday school lessons and reaches into realms that most people never dare to explore. Picture this. You're walking through the most perfect garden imaginable. Every flower blooms with impossible beauty. Every tree bears fruit that satisfies like nothing ever could. And every breath you take fills your lungs with pure, untainted air. This is Eden, and you are witnessing the final moments before everything changes forever. But here's what they didn't tell you in those childhood stories. The encounter that's about to unfold involves forces far more ancient and powerful than a simple talking snake. The serpent of Genesis has haunted human imagination for millennia. But what if I told you that this figure represents something so much more complex, so much more terrifying, and so much more significant than anyone dared to suggest? We're about to embark on a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about good and evil, about the nature of temptation itself, and about a cosmic battle that began before time and continues to this very day. In this series, we'll peel back layers of translation, tradition, and assumption to reveal what the original Hebrew texts actually say about this mysterious being. We'll explore connections that span the entire biblical narrative, from the heights of heaven to the depths of human experience. And here's the most incredible part. We'll discover how this ancient story of deception contains within it the seeds of the greatest victory ever achieved. If you're ready to see beyond the surface, to question what you've always been told, and to uncover truths that have been hidden in plain sight for thousands of years, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button because this journey is just beginning. And trust me, you won't want to miss what we're about to reveal. Let's start with what everyone thinks they know. Walk into any church, any Sunday school classroom, any children's Bible study, and you'll hear the same story told the same way. There's a garden, there's a tree, there's forbidden fruit, and there's a snake that talks Eve into making the worst decision in human history. It's presented as straightforward moral instruction. Don't disobey God, don't listen to temptation, don't eat what you're not supposed to eat. But here's the first question that should make you pause. When was the last time you had a conversation with a snake? When was the last time any animal spoke to you in clear, rational sentences, engaging you in philosophical debate about the nature of knowledge and mortality? If a snake started talking to you tomorrow, would you casually chat with it, or would you run screaming in the opposite direction? Yet Eve, according to the traditional telling, has this extended dialogue with a serpent as if it's the most natural thing in the world. She doesn't seem startled. She doesn't seem confused. She doesn't even seem surprised. She engages with this creature as if speaking animals were a normal part of her daily experience. That alone should tell us there's more to this story than meets the eye. The traditional narrative presents us with a God who creates a perfect world, places the first humans in paradise, gives them one simple rule to follow, and then allows a talking snake to ruin everything. When you step back and really think about it, this version of events raises more questions than it answers. Why would an all-knowing, all-powerful God permit such a scenario? Why would the fate of all humanity hinge on a conversation with a reptile? These questions aren't blasphemous, they're necessary. They point us toward a deeper understanding of what's really happening in this ancient text. The story we've been told is true, but it's incomplete. It's like looking at a magnificent painting through a keyhole. You can see something beautiful and meaningful, but you're missing the full scope and grandeur of what's actually there. The serpent in popular culture has become almost cartoonish. We see it depicted as a green snake with a mischievous grin, sometimes even wearing a hat or speaking with a theatrical accent. This portrayal has done more to obscure the truth than almost anything else. We've turned one of the most significant spiritual encounters in human history into a children's fable, complete with simplified moral lessons and easy answers. But what if the serpent wasn't simple at all? What if this figure represents something far more complex, far more intelligent, and far more dangerous than we've been led to believe? What if the encounter in Eden wasn't a chance meeting between a curious woman and a clever animal, but rather a calculated assault by a being of immense power and knowledge? The fruit itself has become the subject of endless speculation. Was it an apple, a fig, some mysterious supernatural fruit that no longer exists? Again, these questions miss the point entirely. The focus on the physical fruit distracts us from the real issue, the nature of the choice being offered, and the identity of the one offering it. The serpent doesn't just suggest that Eve eat the fruit. It makes specific claims about what will happen when she does. It promises knowledge, wisdom, and godlike understanding. These aren't the random temptations of a mindless animal. They're sophisticated psychological manipulations designed to appeal to the deepest human desires for understanding and transcendence. This brings us to one of the most overlooked aspects of the entire narrative. The serpent demonstrates intimate knowledge of God's commands, God's nature, and God's plans. How does a snake know these things? How does it understand the theological implications of the choice it's presenting? How does it possess the wisdom to craft such a compelling argument? The traditional interpretation leaves us with a God who seems almost careless, allowing his perfect creation to be derailed by a talking animal. But what if the reality is far more profound? What if we're witnessing not a simple case of animal cunning, but the first recorded instance of spiritual warfare? A battle between cosmic forces that uses the physical world as its battlefield. This is where the Hebrew text becomes crucial. Languages aren't just different ways of saying the same thing. They carry unique concepts, cultural understandings, and layers of meaning that can be lost when translated. The Hebrew language, in particular, is rich with symbolism, multiple meanings, and spiritual significance that often doesn't survive the journey into English. When we read serpent in our English Bibles, we're seeing the end result of thousands of years of translation, interpretation, and cultural assumption. But the original Hebrew word carries implications that are far more complex and far more revealing than our simplified understanding suggests. The Hebrew term used in Genesis opens doorways to meanings that transform our entire understanding of what's happening in the garden. It points us toward a figure who is not just physically present, but spiritually significant, not just intelligent, but divinely aware, not just cunning, but cosmically connected to forces and knowledge beyond the natural world. This is where our journey truly begins. In the ancient Hebrew text lies a mystery that has been hidden in plain sight for millennia. The clues are all there, waiting for those willing to dig deeper than surface interpretations and popular assumptions. The Serpent of Eden is far more than a snake. It's a key that unlocks understanding about the nature of evil, the reality of spiritual warfare, and the cosmic drama that encompasses all of human history. As we prepare to dive into these Hebrew mysteries, consider this. If the serpent isn't what we thought it was, then everything else about this story might need to be reconsidered as well. The nature of the temptation, the significance of the choice, the meaning of the consequences, and most importantly, the promise of redemption that emerges from this moment of cosmic crisis. The ancient Hebrews understood something about this encounter that we've forgotten. They preserved clues in their language, their culture, and their continued writings that point toward a truth far more magnificent and terrifying than a simple moral lesson about obedience. They knew they were recording not just the story of humanity's first mistake, but the opening chapter of a war that would span all of time and determine the fate of creation itself. What we're about to discover will challenge comfortable assumptions, and demand that we grapple with realities that are both darker and more hopeful than we ever imagined. The serpent's true identity opens doorways to understanding that reach from the heights of heaven to the depths of human experience, connecting threads that run through the entire biblical narrative and into our present moment. Are you ready to see what's been hidden in plain sight? Are you prepared to encounter a truth that's both more disturbing and more wonderful than the simplified version you've always known? The Hebrew text is waiting to reveal its secrets, and the serpent's true story is about to unfold. The Hebrew word that changes everything is nachash. When you see this word in the ancient text, you're not just looking at a simple label for a garden snake. You're encountering a term that carries layers of meaning so profound that scholars have spent centuries trying to unpack its full significance. This single word is the key that unlocks the mystery we've been exploring, and what it reveals will fundamentally alter how you understand not just this story, but the entire cosmic drama playing out around us. Nachash operates on 3 distinct levels of meaning, each one more revealing than the last. On the surface level, yes, it can mean serpent or snake. This is the translation that made it into our English Bibles, and it's not wrong. It's just incomplete. It's like describing the ocean as wet, technically accurate, but missing the vast depths beneath the surface. But here's where it gets fascinating. The root of nachash also means to shine, or the shining one. Suddenly, we're not talking about a creature crawling on its belly through the dust. We're talking about a being of radiance, of light, of brilliance, that would have been immediately recognizable to ancient readers as something far beyond the natural world. The Hebrew scribes weren't describing a snake, they were describing a luminous entity, a being whose very nature was to shine with an otherworldly light. The third meaning cuts even deeper. Nachash also carries the connotation of divination, of supernatural knowledge, of one who practices enchantment. This isn't just intelligence. This is otherworldly wisdom combined with the power to manipulate reality through spiritual means. The ancient Hebrew mind would have immediately understood that they were dealing with a being who possessed knowledge and abilities that transcended the physical realm. Now picture the scene again, but with this understanding. Eve isn't talking to a snake. She's encountering a shining being, radiant with light, possessing supernatural knowledge and abilities that mark it as something from beyond the natural order. Suddenly, her willingness to engage in conversation makes perfect sense. This wasn't a talking animal. This was a divine encounter with a being that appeared to possess the very attributes of deity itself. The genius of the Hebrew language is that it preserved all 3 meanings simultaneously. The ancient readers would have understood that they were witnessing something that operated on multiple levels, physically present as a serpent-like being, spiritually manifest as a shining entity, and cosmically significant as a practitioner of supernatural arts. This wasn't just storytelling. This was theological truth encoded in language that could carry multiple layers of meaning without losing any of them. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. When you understand Nachash in its full Hebrew context, you begin to see connections that span the entire biblical narrative. This shining one, this divine being with supernatural knowledge, doesn't appear in Genesis and then disappear. The pattern of the Nachash echoes throughout Scripture, appearing in different forms, but always carrying the same essential characteristics: luminous, knowledgeable, deceptive, and ultimately opposed to God's purposes. The book of Ezekiel provides us with one of the most detailed descriptions of such a being. In chapter 28, the prophet describes an entity that was in Eden, the garden of God, covered with precious stones, walking among fiery stones, perfect in beauty and full of wisdom. This being was an anointed cherub, a guardian who walked in the very presence of God. The description matches exactly what we would expect from a Nachash, a shining one with supernatural knowledge and access to divine realms. But something went wrong. The text tells us that iniquity was found in this perfect being. Pride entered its heart. The desire for worship, for recognition, for a position equal to God himself consumed what had once been a perfect servant. The shining one became the deceiver. The guardian became the rebel. The anointed cherub became the serpent of Eden. Isaiah's prophecy provides another piece of this puzzle. The morning star, the son of the dawn, the one who said in his heart, "I will ascend to heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will make myself like the Most High." This being's fall is described in terms that perfectly align with our understanding of the Nachash. A creature of light becomes a creature of darkness through the corruption of pride and the desire for divine status. This is why Eve wasn't startled by the serpent's appearance or abilities. She was encountering a being that still retained much of its original glory, still shone with divine light, still possessed supernatural knowledge. To her unfallen eyes, this creature would have appeared as a legitimate representative of the divine realm, someone worthy of attention and consideration. The deception wasn't just in the words spoken, it was in the very appearance of the deceiver. This being presented itself with all the hallmarks of divine authority: radiance, wisdom, knowledge of God's commands and purposes. It was the perfect counterfeit, beautiful enough to attract attention, knowledgeable enough to seem trustworthy, and subtle enough to plant seeds of doubt without appearing to directly contradict God. This understanding transforms our entire perspective on the nature of spiritual warfare. We're not dealing with cartoon devils with pitchforks and pointed tails. We're confronting beings of genuine power and beauty who have turned their gifts toward deception and destruction. The enemy doesn't come to us looking obviously evil. He comes as an angel of light, as a shining one, as someone who appears to offer wisdom and understanding. The Hebrew concept of Nachash reveals that deception operates not through obvious lies, but through partial truths presented by seemingly authoritative sources. The serpent in Eden didn't tell Eve something completely false. It told her something that was true in part, but catastrophically incomplete. Yes, eating the fruit would give knowledge of good and evil. Yes, it would make them like God in that specific aspect. But it left out the consequences, the cost, the separation that would result. This pattern of deception, truth mixed with lies, presented by beings who appear to possess divine authority, runs throughout human history. Every false religion, every cult, every deceptive philosophy contains elements of truth wrapped in fatal deceptions. The Nachash principle shows us that the most dangerous lies are those that contain enough truth to seem credible. Understanding the Hebrew Nachash also explains why the judgment pronounced on the serpent is so specific. God doesn't just curse a snake to crawl on its belly. He's describing the complete humiliation of a being that once stood in the heights of heaven. The crawling on the belly becomes a symbol of the ultimate degradation of one who once walked upright in the presence of the Almighty. The dust that the serpent is condemned to eat represents not just physical humiliation, but spiritual poverty. This being, who once shone with divine light, who once possessed the treasures of heaven, is now reduced to consuming the lowest elements of creation. It's a picture of complete reversal, from the heights of glory to the depths of degradation. But the most significant part of God's judgment is the promise embedded within it, the declaration of ongoing warfare between the serpent's offspring and the woman's offspring, culminating in a decisive victory where the serpent's head would be crushed. This isn't just a prediction. It's a promise that the deception in Eden was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a redemptive plan that would ultimately restore what was lost. The Hebrew understanding of Nachash reveals that the encounter in Eden was far more than a moral failure. It was the opening battle in a cosmic war. The Shining One, who had rebelled in heaven, brought that rebellion to earth, targeting God's newest creation, in an attempt to corrupt and claim what God had made. But even in pronouncing judgment, God revealed that this attack would not go unanswered. As we delve deeper into this mystery, we begin to see how the story of the Nachash connects to every aspect of human experience. The patterns of deception, the allure of forbidden knowledge, the corruption of beauty and wisdom for selfish purposes. These themes echo through every generation because we're still living in the aftermath of that first cosmic deception. The serpent's true identity as a fallen shining one helps us understand why spiritual warfare is so often subtle rather than obvious. We're not primarily fighting against crude evil, but against corrupted good. Beings who still retain much of their original power and beauty, but have turned these gifts toward destructive purposes. This is why discernment is so crucial, why we must test every spirit, why we cannot simply trust appearances, no matter how impressive they might be. The revelation of the Nachash, as a shining one, opens a doorway into understanding one of the most profound mysteries in all of Scripture, the nature of evil itself. But to truly grasp what happened in that garden, we need to journey even deeper into the cosmic drama that was already unfolding long before Adam and Eve drew their first breath. The serpent didn't arrive in Eden by accident. This was a calculated strike in a war that had already begun in the highest realms of creation. To understand the serpent's true nature, we must first understand where it came from. The biblical narrative gives us glimpses of a reality that existed before the creation of our world, a realm of pure spirit where beings of incredible power and beauty served in the very presence of the Almighty. These weren't the chubby-cheeked cherubs of Renaissance paintings. These were creatures of such magnificence that their very appearance could inspire terror or worship in equal measure. Among these beings was one who stood above all others. The Hebrew term, Helel ben Shachar, the Shining One, Son of the Dawn, points us toward a figure of such radiant beauty and perfect wisdom that he became the crown jewel of creation itself. This being wasn't created to be ordinary. Every aspect of his design spoke of excellence, of perfection, of a role that would place him at the very center of cosmic worship and service. Picture a being covered with every precious stone imaginable: sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, turquoise, emerald. But these weren't mere decorations. In the ancient Hebrew understanding, precious stones were repositories of light, each one capturing and reflecting divine radiance in unique ways. This being was literally clothed in light itself, a walking prism that took the pure radiance of God's presence and broke it into every conceivable spectrum of beauty. The text tells us that the workmanship of his settings and engravings was prepared on the day he was created. This wasn't random decoration. This was intentional design by the Creator himself. God had crafted this being to be a masterpiece, a living demonstration of divine artistry that would serve as a bridge between the throne of heaven and the rest of creation. Every detail of his construction spoke of purpose, of destiny, of a role that would be central to the cosmic order. But perhaps most significantly, this being was designated as an anointed cherub. In the ancient world, anointing was reserved for those chosen for the highest positions of authority and responsibility. Kings were anointed, priests were anointed, prophets were anointed. To be an anointed cherub meant to hold a position of trust and authority that was virtually unimaginable. Direct access to the throne of God, responsibility for guarding the most sacred aspects of divine presence. The role of the cherubim in Hebrew theology cannot be overstated. These weren't cute angels playing harps on clouds. They were the mighty guardians of God's holiness, beings of such power that their very presence could consume anything unholy that dared approach the divine throne. They were living extensions of God's own authority, entrusted with maintaining the perfect order of heaven itself. And this particular cherub wasn't just any guardian. He was the anointed one, the chosen one, the being selected above all others to serve in the most intimate proximity to divine glory. He walked back and forth in the midst of fiery stones, moving freely through realms of such holiness that even other heavenly beings couldn't approach. He was perfect in his ways from the day he was created, without flaw, without error, without any shadow of imperfection. But then something happened that shattered the perfect harmony of heaven itself. The text uses a phrase that sends chills through anyone who truly understands its implications. Until iniquity was found in you. Not created in him, not placed there by God, not the result of some external corruption. Iniquity was found in him. It arose from within, a corruption that emerged from the very perfection of his being. What could cause such a magnificent creature to fall? The answer lies in understanding the nature of perfection itself. This being had been created with every gift, every beauty, every power that could be bestowed on a created being. He lacked nothing that could be given. But there was one thing that remained beyond his reach, the position of worship that belonged to God alone. Pride became his downfall, but not the petty pride of human arrogance. This was cosmic pride, the desire of a being who had experienced the heights of created perfection to transcend the boundaries of creaturehood itself. He began to look at his gifts and see them as inherent rights. He began to view his position as evidence of his own worthiness rather than God's grace. He began to believe that the worship he facilitated should be directed toward him instead. The 5 "I will" statements recorded in Isaiah reveal the progression of this cosmic rebellion. I will ascend to heaven, the desire to rise above his appointed position. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. The determination to rule over other heavenly beings. I will sit on the Mount of Assembly. The claim to divine authority over creation. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. The attempt to transcend the boundaries between creature and creator. I will be like the Most High. The ultimate blasphemy, the claim to deity itself. Each statement represents a step deeper into rebellion, a progressive corruption of the very gifts that had made him glorious. His beauty became vanity, his wisdom became cunning, his authority became tyranny, his light became darkness. The being who had been created to reflect God's glory began to demand that glory for himself. The war that followed wasn't a battle between equals. God didn't struggle to put down this rebellion. He simply withdrew his sustaining presence, and the rebel fell like lightning from heaven. But the fall of this being had consequences that rippled through all of creation. He didn't simply disappear or cease to exist. Instead, he became something new and terrible, the adversary, the accuser, the one whose very nature had become opposition to everything God represented. This fallen cherub retained much of his original power and beauty, but now these gifts were turned toward destructive purposes. He became the master of deception, using his intimate knowledge of divine truth to craft lies so sophisticated that they could deceive even those who walked with God. His radiance, though dimmed, was still sufficient to present himself as an angel of light. His wisdom, though corrupted, was still vast enough to understand and exploit the weaknesses of other created beings. When this being appeared in Eden as the Nachash, he wasn't some random tempter who happened to wander into the garden. This was a calculated assault by a being who understood exactly what he was attacking and why. He knew that Adam and Eve represented something precious to God, beings created in the divine image, designed for intimate fellowship with their Creator. By corrupting them, he could strike at the very heart of God's creative purpose. The serpent's approach to Eve reveals the sophistication of his strategy. He didn't appear as a monster or openly declare his hostile intentions. Instead, he came as a being of light and knowledge, someone who seemed to possess information that could benefit her. He He presented himself as a concerned party who wanted to help her achieve her full potential, to break free from what he portrayed as unnecessary restrictions. The question, "Has God really said?" wasn't just a request for information. It was a masterfully crafted assault on the foundation of Eve's relationship with God, by introducing doubt about God's word, by suggesting that divine commands might not be in her best interest, by implying that God might be withholding something good from her. The serpent began to erode the trust that was essential to her spiritual well-being. The lie that followed, "You will not surely die," was perhaps the most sophisticated deception ever crafted. It wasn't completely false, because Adam and Eve didn't immediately drop dead when they ate the fruit. But it concealed the deeper truth about what death really means. Physical death would indeed come, but spiritual death, separation from God, occurred immediately. The serpent told a truth that was actually a lie, presented a fact that concealed a deeper reality. The promise, "You will be like God, knowing good and evil," contained enough truth to be believable while hiding its devastating consequences. Yes, they would gain knowledge of good and evil, but not through the wise instruction of a loving father. Instead, they would learn about evil through personal experience, through the corruption of their own nature, through the loss of innocence that could never be fully recovered. This pattern of deception, truth mixed with lies, benefits coupled with hidden costs, freedom that actually leads to bondage, became the template for every subsequent temptation. The fallen cherub had discovered that the most effective deceptions aren't obvious falsehoods, but subtle distortions of truth presented by seemingly credible sources. The cosmic implications of this deception extend far beyond the immediate consequences for Adam and Eve. By successfully corrupting God's newest creation, the fallen being had demonstrated that he could strike at the very heart of divine purpose. He had shown that even beings created in God's image could be turned against their creator through clever manipulation and the exploitation of their God-given freedom. But even in this moment of apparent victory, the seeds of the serpent's ultimate defeat were already being sown. The very success of his deception would become the foundation for his eventual destruction. By entering the human story, by making himself a player in the cosmic drama, he had also made himself vulnerable to the redemptive plan that God would unfold through human history. The curse pronounced upon the serpent wasn't just punishment, it was prophecy. The promise that the woman's offspring would crush the serpent's head while he could only strike at the heel revealed that this cosmic rebel's apparent victory was actually the beginning of his ultimate defeat. He had won a battle, but in doing so, he had guaranteed that he would lose the war. As we begin to understand the true identity of the serpent, not a simple snake, but a fallen being of cosmic power and beauty, we start to see how this ancient story connects to every aspect of human experience. The patterns of deception, the allure of forbidden knowledge, the corruption of good gifts for selfish purposes, the way evil often presents itself in beautiful packaging. All of these themes echo through every generation because we're still living in the aftermath of that first cosmic deception. The fallen cherub who became the serpent is still active in our world, still using the same sophisticated strategies that proved so effective in Eden. He still appears as an angel of light, still offers knowledge and power and freedom, still suggests that God's restrictions are really limitations designed to hold us back from our true potential. The names have changed, the cultural packaging has evolved, but the essential deception remains the same. Understanding who the serpent really was helps us recognize these deceptions when they appear in our own lives. When someone offers us something that seems too good to be true, when we're tempted to compromise our principles for apparent benefits, when we find ourselves questioning whether God's ways are really in our best interest. These are echoes of that first conversation in Eden. Moments when the same ancient enemy is using the same ancient strategies. But here's the beautiful truth that emerges from understanding the serpent's true identity. If this cosmic rebel could be defeated once, he can be defeated again. If God had a plan to overcome the consequences of that first deception, he has plans to overcome every subsequent attack. The story of the serpent isn't ultimately about the power of evil, it's about the greater power of redemptive love. The same God who pronounced judgment on the serpent also promised redemption for those who had been deceived. The same divine wisdom that saw through the rebellion in heaven also foresaw the victory that would come through the woman's offspring. The cosmic drama that began with the fall of a shining one would ultimately culminate in the triumph of an even greater light. One who would not only resist temptation, but would pay the price for all who had fallen to it. As we prepare to explore how this ancient promise of victory was fulfilled, remember that you're not just learning about historical events. You're discovering the cosmic context for your own spiritual battles, the deeper meaning behind the temptations you face, and the ultimate source of hope for every situation where evil seems to have the upper hand. The serpent's story is far from over, but neither is the story of redemption that began the moment his deception succeeded. The moment the serpent succeeded in Eden, something profound shifted in the fabric of reality itself. This wasn't just a moral failure or a simple case of disobedience. This was the moment when cosmic warfare spilled over into the human realm. The consequences that followed weren't arbitrary punishments handed down by an angry deity. They were the natural result of spiritual laws as fixed and immutable as the laws of physics, set into motion by choices that echoed through dimensions we can barely comprehend. When Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden tree, they didn't just break a rule, they shattered their connection to the source of life itself. The Hebrew understanding of death encompasses far more than physical cessation. It represents separation, disconnection, the severing of relationships that were meant to be eternal. In that moment, humanity experienced death in ways they had never imagined possible. The shame they felt wasn't embarrassment about their physical nakedness. It was the sudden awareness of spiritual exposure, the terrifying realization that they were now vulnerable in ways they had never been before. They had traded the covering of divine glory for the fragile protection of fig leaves, exchanging an eternal inheritance for temporary knowledge that brought them more pain than wisdom. But here's what makes this moment even more tragic. They weren't alone in their fall. The entire created order was bound up with humanity's destiny. When the crown of creation fell, everything under their stewardship was dragged down with them. The ground that had eagerly yielded its bounty now resisted their efforts. The animals that had lived in harmony with them now fled in fear. The very atoms of creation began their slow dance toward entropy and decay. The curse that fell upon the serpent reveals the cosmic scope of what had just occurred. God's words weren't spoken only to a snake. They were pronounced upon the fallen cherub who had orchestrated this disaster. Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and you will eat dust all the days of your life. This imagery of crawling and dust eating represents the complete reversal of the serpent's former glory. The being who once stood upright in the presence of the Almighty, who once walked among fiery stones in heavenly realms, was now condemned to the lowest possible position. The dust he would eat symbolized not just physical degradation but spiritual poverty. This creature who once feasted on divine truth was now reduced to consuming the basest elements of creation. But embedded within this curse was something that should have made the serpent tremble with fear. God's declaration of enmity between the serpent's offspring and the woman's offspring wasn't just a prediction of ongoing conflict. It was a promise of ultimate victory. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. These words contained a prophecy that would echo through every generation. A promise that the serpent's apparent triumph was actually the beginning of his ultimate defeat. The asymmetry in this prophecy is crucial. The serpent would strike at the heel, painful, debilitating, but not fatal. The woman's offspring would crush the head, a blow that would be decisive and permanent. Even in pronouncing judgment, God was revealing that this cosmic rebel's apparent victory was temporary, that his ultimate destruction was already sealed. For Adam and Eve, the immediate consequences were devastating but not hopeless. The ground would resist their efforts, but it would still yield food. Childbirth would be painful, but children would still be born. Death would enter their experience, but life would continue. Even in judgment, mercy was woven throughout the consequences. The expulsion from Eden wasn't just punishment, it was protection. God's concern that they might eat from the tree of life and live forever in their fallen state reveals the depth of his love, even in discipline. An eternity of separation from God, locked in a state of spiritual death, would have been the cruelest fate imaginable. By barring them from the tree of life, God was preserving the possibility of redemption, ensuring that their condition remained temporary rather than permanent. The cherubim placed at the gates of Eden with flaming swords weren't just guards, they were guardians of hope. Every time Adam and Eve looked toward their former home and saw those blazing weapons, they were reminded that the way back existed but was not yet open. The barrier was real, but it wasn't necessarily permanent. The flaming swords spoke of holiness that could not be compromised, but they also hinted at a future when the way to the tree of life might be opened once again. As the first family began their life outside Eden, they carried with them both the weight of their choice and the promise of eventual restoration. Every sunrise reminded them of the light they had lost, but also of the faithfulness of a God who had not abandoned them completely. Every birth brought the possibility that this child might be the one promised to crush the serpent's head. Every death confirmed the reality of their condition, but also the urgency of finding the path back to life. The serpent, meanwhile, discovered that his victory was more complicated than he had anticipated. By successfully corrupting humanity, he had indeed struck a blow against God's creative purposes. But he had also guaranteed his own eventual destruction. The very success of his deception had made him a marked being, targeted for judgment by the same divine justice that had expelled him from heaven. More immediately, the serpent found that his new relationship with humanity was far more complex than simple dominion. While he had gained influence over the human race through their fallen nature, he had also made himself vulnerable to them in ways he hadn't anticipated. The promise that the woman's offspring would crush his head meant that his greatest threat would come not from angelic armies, but from the very beings he had corrupted. This cosmic irony, that the serpent's victory contained the seeds of his defeat, reveals the wisdom of God's redemptive plan. Rather than simply starting over with a new creation, God chose to work through the very beings who had been deceived. The rescue would come from within humanity itself, demonstrating that love is more powerful than deception, that sacrifice can overcome selfishness, that light ultimately conquers darkness. The pattern established in Eden, deception leading to death, followed by the promise of redemption, became the template for understanding all of human history. Every subsequent temptation would echo that first conversation between the serpent and Eve. Every fall would mirror that first bite of forbidden fruit. But every promise of hope would also point back to those words spoken in judgment. He will crush your head. The generations that followed carried forward both the corruption and the promise. Cain's murder of Abel demonstrated how quickly violence could spread once innocence was lost, but it also revealed the ongoing conflict between the serpent's offspring and those who belong to God. The line of Seth preserved the hope of redemption, even as the world grew increasingly dark around them. Noah's flood showed both the devastating consequences of unchecked evil and God's determination to preserve the promise of redemption. When the waters receded and Noah built his altar, the rainbow that appeared in the sky wasn't just a promise about weather. It was a reminder that judgment and mercy were inextricably linked in God's plan. Abraham's call represented a new chapter in the unfolding drama. Through this one man and his descendants, God would bless all the families of the earth. The promise to crush the serpent's head was beginning to take more specific shape. It wouldn't be a general victory over evil. It would come through a particular people, in a particular way, at a particular time. The story of Israel reveals both the persistence of the serpent's influence and the faithfulness of God's promise. Every time the people fell into idolatry, they were repeating Eve's choice to trust someone other than God. Every time they were delivered from bondage, they were experiencing a foretaste of the ultimate deliverance that was coming. The prophets spoke in increasingly specific terms about the one who would come to fulfill the ancient promise. He would be born of a woman, as promised in Eden. He would come from the line of David, the royal line of Israel. He would suffer, as indicated by the striking of the heel, but he would also triumph, crushing the serpent's head once and for all. Daniel's visions revealed that this conflict had cosmic dimensions. The beast he saw rising from the sea represented earthly kingdoms influenced by the same rebellious spirit that had first appeared as a serpent in Eden. But he also saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven, one who would receive dominion and glory and a kingdom that would never pass away. Isaiah's prophecies painted a picture of a suffering servant who would bear the sins of many, making it possible for the effects of Eden's curse to be reversed. He would be wounded for humanity's transgressions, bruised for their iniquities. The chastisement that would bring peace would fall upon him, and by his stripes humanity would be healed. Ezekiel's vision of dry bones coming to life spoke of resurrection, of death being reversed, of the ultimate victory over the grave that the serpent had opened for humanity. The prophets saw a time when God's Spirit would breathe life into death itself, when what seemed permanently lost would be permanently restored. The Psalms are filled with references to this ongoing cosmic battle. David writes of being surrounded by enemies, of evil plotting in dark places, of the righteous crying out for deliverance. But he also writes of confidence in God's ultimate victory, of evil being destroyed and righteousness being established forever. Malachi's prophecy brings the Old Testament to a close with a promise that the Son of Righteousness would rise with healing in its wings. The long night that began in Eden would not last forever. Dawn was coming, and with it would come the healing that humanity had been longing for since that first day when they hid from God's voice in the garden. As the centuries passed and the silence between the testaments deepened, the promise remained alive in the hearts of those who still believed. They watched for signs of the coming one, studied the prophecies for clues about his arrival, and maintained hope that the ancient curse would one day be broken. The serpent, meanwhile, continued his work of deception and destruction. Every false religion, every corrupt philosophy, every twisted ideology bore his fingerprints. He raised up kingdoms and tore them down, always working to prevent the fulfillment of the promise that haunted his existence. He knew that somewhere, somehow, the one who would crush his head was coming, and he was determined to prevent it if possible. But the very persistence of evil served to highlight humanity's need for redemption. Every injustice cried out for a perfect judge. Every act of hatred revealed the need for perfect love. Every death served as a reminder that the curse was real, and that only divine intervention could reverse it. The stage was being set for the climactic confrontation that had been promised since Eden. The serpent had enjoyed thousands of years of apparent victory, corrupting individual lives and entire civilizations, spreading his rebellion throughout the human race. But all of this was leading toward a moment when the ancient promise would be fulfilled in ways that would exceed every expectation and transform every understanding of what redemption could mean. The story of the serpent wasn't ending. It was building toward its ultimate resolution. And when that resolution came, It would reveal that every apparent victory of evil had actually been serving the purposes of a love so profound that it could transform even the greatest tragedy into the foundation for the greatest triumph. The cosmic chess match that began with deception in a garden was about to reach its decisive move, and the serpent was about to discover that he had been playing against an opponent whose wisdom exceeded his own by infinite measures. The ancient promise was about to be fulfilled, but in ways that would reveal depths of divine love and wisdom that no created being could have imagined. The crusher of the serpent's head was coming, and with him would come the reversal of everything that had gone wrong since that first bite of forbidden fruit. But the cost of that victory and the method of that triumph would prove to be as shocking as they were wonderful, as unexpected as they were inevitable. The moment had finally arrived. After millennia of waiting, after countless generations had lived and died, carrying the weight of that ancient promise, the time had come for the cosmic drama to reach its climax. But when the fulfillment finally appeared, it came in a way that caught everyone off guard, including the serpent himself. A young woman in an obscure village received a visit from an angel. The message was simple yet world-shattering. She would conceive and give birth to a son, and this son would be the one who would fulfill every promise ever made about crushing the serpent's head. But there was something about this announcement that made it even more extraordinary than anyone could have anticipated. This child would not be born through ordinary human generation. The Spirit of the Most High would overshadow her, meaning that while he would be fully human through his mother, he would also be fully divine through his father. This wasn't just another descendant of Eve who might have the strength to fight the serpent. This was God himself entering the human story to personally settle the score that had been outstanding since Eden. The implications were staggering. The serpent had corrupted humanity by convincing them to reach for divinity through disobedience. Now God was entering humanity through obedience, taking on flesh and blood to accomplish from within what could never be achieved from without. The fallen cherub who had once declared, "I will be like the Most High," was about to face the Most High who had chosen to become like humanity. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the cosmic forces that had been in conflict since before time began were suddenly confronted with something unprecedented. Here was a human being who was also divine, a descendant of Adam who was also the eternal Son of God. The ancient promise was taking flesh, breathing air, learning to walk and talk and laugh. The crusher of the serpent's head had arrived, but he came as a baby. The serpent's response was swift and vicious. Through King Herod, he orchestrated the massacre of innocent children, hoping to eliminate this threat before it could mature. It was the same strategy he had always used: corrupt those in power and use them to attack God's purposes. But the plan failed. The child escaped to Egypt, and the promise remained alive. As Jesus grew and began his ministry, the cosmic battle that had been largely hidden for millennia suddenly became visible. The confrontations weren't just between Jesus and human opponents. They were between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness, between the promise of Eden and the deception that had corrupted it. When Jesus faced temptation in the wilderness, we see the serpent employing the exact same strategies that had worked so effectively in Eden. The offer of bread to satisfy physical hunger echoed the appeal to physical appetite that had ensnared Eve. The promise of worldly kingdoms in exchange for worship was the same lie about gaining power and status that had corrupted the original rebellion. The challenge to prove his divine nature by throwing himself from the temple was another version of the serpent's suggestion that God's word couldn't be trusted. But this time, the outcome was different. Where Adam and Eve had failed, Jesus succeeded. Where the first humans had chosen to doubt God's word, Jesus responded with absolute confidence in what his Father had said. "It is written" became his response to every temptation, demonstrating that the power to resist the serpent's deceptions lay not in human strength, but in unwavering trust in divine truth. The serpent's frustration must have been intense. For the first time since his rebellion began, he had encountered a human being who could not be corrupted, could not be deceived, could not be turned against God's purposes. Every strategy that had worked for thousands of years was proving ineffective against this one man. But Jesus didn't stop with successful resistance to temptation. He began to actively invade the serpent's territory, liberating those who had been held captive by deception and spiritual darkness. When he cast out demons, he was demonstrating that the serpent's authority over humanity was not absolute. When he healed the sick, he was reversing the effects of the curse that had brought disease and death into the world. When he raised the dead, he was proving that even the serpent's greatest weapon, death itself, was not beyond the reach of divine power. The religious leaders of the day couldn't understand what they were witnessing. They saw Jesus' power, but attributed it to demonic sources, not recognizing that they were watching the ancient promise being fulfilled before their eyes. Their inability to perceive the truth revealed how completely the serpent's deception had infiltrated even those who claimed to serve God. But Jesus saw through their spiritual blindness to the real source of their opposition. When he called them children of their father, the devil, he was identifying the same spirit that had operated through the serpent in Eden. They were lying, killing, and stealing, just as their spiritual father had done from the beginning. The patterns of deception that began in the garden were still operating through those who had chosen to align themselves with the kingdom of darkness. The miracles Jesus performed weren't just demonstrations of divine power, they were previews of what the world would look like when the serpent's influence was finally eliminated. The blind received sight, representing the spiritual illumination that would come when deception was replaced by truth. The lame walked, symbolizing the restoration of humanity's ability to follow God's paths. The dead were raised, pointing toward the ultimate victory over the death that the serpent had introduced. Every healing was a small-scale reversal of Eden's curse. Every demon cast out was a liberation from the spiritual bondage that had begun with that first act of deception. Every word of truth spoken was a direct contradiction of the lies that had corrupted human understanding since the beginning. But the serpent still had one more card to play. If he couldn't corrupt this perfect human being, perhaps he could destroy him. Through Judas Iscariot, he orchestrated the betrayal that would lead to Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. The ancient adversary must have felt a surge of triumph as he watched the promised crusher of his head being nailed to a Roman cross. Here was the ultimate irony. The one who was supposed to defeat death was himself dying. The one who came to crush the serpent's head was being struck down by human hatred and divine judgment. It appeared that the serpent had finally achieved the victory that had eluded him for so long. The ancient promise was dying on a cross, and with it died the hope of redemption for the human race. But the serpent had made a fatal miscalculation. He had focused so intently on preventing his own defeat that he had failed to understand the true nature of the victory that was being won. The cross wasn't Jesus' defeat, it was his triumph. The death wasn't the end of the promise, it was the fulfillment of it. By living a perfect life, Jesus had proven that the serpent's claim about the impossibility of human obedience was false. By dying an innocent death, he was paying the price for every act of disobedience that had followed from Eden's fall. The justice that demanded punishment for sin was being satisfied, but not by the punishment of the guilty. Instead, the innocent was taking the place of the guilty. The perfect was dying for the imperfect. The sinless was bearing the consequences of sin. This wasn't just a legal transaction, it was a cosmic reversal. Every lie the serpent had ever told was being exposed and contradicted. The claim that God didn't really love humanity was shattered by the sight of God's Son dying for those who had rejected him. The suggestion that God's commands were restrictive rather than protective was proven false by the ultimate demonstration of self-sacrificial love. The promise that disobedience would lead to freedom was revealed as the deception it had always been by the spectacle of perfect obedience, leading to perfect liberation. But even more significantly, the cross was accomplishing something that the serpent had never anticipated. By taking on himself the full weight of human sin and divine judgment, Jesus was not just paying a price, he was breaking a power. The authority that the serpent had gained over humanity through their fall was being legally revoked. The claim he had staked on human souls through their participation in his rebellion was being challenged and overturned. When Jesus cried out, "It is finished," he wasn't just announcing the end of his earthly suffering. He was declaring that the work of redemption was complete, that the price had been paid, that the victory had been won. The serpent's head was being crushed, but the method of that crushing was unlike anything anyone had imagined. The strike at the heel that the ancient prophecy had predicted was real and devastating. Jesus experienced the full force of the serpent's hatred, suffering not just physical agony, but spiritual anguish as he bore the weight of all human sin. The separation from his Father that sin always brings was experienced by the sinless one in ways that no human being could fully comprehend. But the crushing of the serpent's head was even more complete than the striking of the heel. By destroying the legal basis for the serpent's claims over humanity, by paying the price that justice demanded, by demonstrating the love that overcomes hatred, Jesus had accomplished something that would echo through eternity. The cosmic rebel, who had seemed so powerful, was being revealed as a defeated foe. The resurrection that followed 3 days later was the public confirmation of what had been accomplished in private on the cross. Death itself, the serpent's ultimate weapon, had been conquered. The grave that had held every human being since Adam was proven powerless to hold the second Adam. The curse that had seemed permanent was revealed to be temporary. When Jesus walked out of that tomb, he was demonstrating that the ancient promise had been fulfilled in the most complete way possible. The serpent's head had been crushed so thoroughly that even his greatest achievement, the introduction of death into human experience, had been reversed. The one who had the power of death had been defeated by the one who had the power of life. The implications rippled backward and forward through all of time. Every person who had ever lived in faith, trusting in God's promise of redemption, was vindicated. Every sacrifice offered in hope of forgiveness was shown to point toward this ultimate sacrifice. Every prophecy about the coming deliverer was revealed to have been perfectly fulfilled. But the implications also rippled forward into every subsequent moment of human history. The serpent's power was broken, his authority revoked, his ultimate defeat assured. While he could still deceive and tempt and cause temporary havoc, his doom was sealed. The legal basis for his rebellion had been eliminated, and his final judgment was now just a matter of time. This is why the Apostle Paul could write with such confidence about the principalities and powers being disarmed and made a public spectacle through the cross. The cosmic battle that had begun in Eden had reached its decisive moment, and the outcome was no longer in doubt. The serpent might continue to thrash about like a wounded snake, but his head had been crushed and his fate was sealed. For every human being who had ever felt the weight of guilt, the power of addiction, the fear of death, or the despair of separation from God, the cross offered hope that was both immediate and eternal. The effects of Eden's fall could be reversed, the serpent's deceptions could be overcome, and the relationship with God that had been broken could be restored. The victory won on the cross wasn't just theoretical, it was practical and personal. Every person who trusted in what Jesus had accomplished could experience the reality of that victory in their own life. The serpent's power to condemn was broken. His authority to accuse was revoked. His ability to separate people from God's love was permanently destroyed. This is why the story of the serpent in Eden isn't just ancient history. It's the backstory to every person's individual struggle with temptation, guilt, and spiritual darkness. Understanding who the serpent really was helps us recognize the true nature of our own battles and the complete adequacy of the victory that has been won on our behalf. The cosmic drama that began with deception in a garden reached its climax with sacrifice on a cross. The ancient promise made in the moment of humanity's greatest failure was fulfilled through the perfect obedience of God's own Son. The serpent who had appeared as a shining one to deceive our first parents was defeated by the true light of the world, who came to illuminate every person. But this victory, complete as it was not the end of the story. The serpent's defeat on the cross guaranteed his ultimate destruction, but the full outworking of that victory is still unfolding. The kingdom of God that Jesus inaugurated through his death and resurrection is still advancing, still conquering territory that was once held by the forces of darkness. Every person who turns from deception to truth, every life that is transformed from death to life, every community that is changed from hatred to love. These are all manifestations of the ongoing effects of the serpent's crushed head. The victory won 2,000 years ago is still being applied and experienced as people discover the reality of what Jesus accomplished. And one day, the victory that was won in principle will be manifested in practice. The serpent who was defeated at the cross will be finally and permanently banished from the presence of God and his people. The curse that began in Eden will be fully reversed, and the paradise that was lost will be restored in even greater glory. The story of the forbidden history of the serpent is ultimately a story of hope triumphant over despair, light conquering darkness, love overcoming hatred. It reveals that no matter how powerful deception might seem, no matter how complete evil's victory might appear, there is a greater power at work that guarantees the ultimate triumph of good. The serpent's story began with pride and rebellion in the heights of heaven. It continued with deception and corruption in the Garden of Eden. But it culminated with defeat and destruction at the cross of Calvary. The ancient enemy has been vanquished, his power broken, his doom sealed. The cosmic battle is won, even as its effects continue to unfold throughout human history. Understanding this hidden history changes everything about how we view our present struggles and future hope. We are not fighting a battle whose outcome is uncertain. We are not facing an enemy whose power is ultimate. We are not alone in a universe where evil might triumph. Instead, we are participants in a victory that has already been won, beneficiaries of a triumph that cost everything and accomplished everything, recipients of a love that proved stronger than the greatest deception ever attempted. The serpent's forbidden history is now fully revealed, and with it comes the assurance that every promise of God will be fulfilled, every work of darkness will be exposed, and every tear will be wiped away. The cosmic drama that seemed to end in tragedy has been revealed as the greatest love story ever told, and we are all invited to participate in its glorious conclusion. The serpent's forbidden history reaches its ultimate conclusion not in some distant theoretical future, but in the very real transformation available to every person who discovers this ancient truth. When you understand who the serpent really was and what his defeat actually accomplished, everything changes about how you view your own struggles, your own temptations, your own battles with darkness. Think about it this way. Every time you felt the pull of deception, every moment when you've been tempted to believe lies about yourself or about God, every instance when you felt trapped by patterns you can't seem to break, these aren't random experiences. They're echoes of that original conversation in Eden, manifestations of the same ancient strategy that the fallen cherub has been using for millennia. But here's what changes everything. That strategy no longer has ultimate power over you. The legal authority that the serpent gained through humanity's fall has been revoked. The claim he staked on human souls through their participation in his rebellion has been challenged and overturned. The cosmic court has ruled in favor of redemption, and the verdict is final. This isn't just theological theory. It's practical reality that transforms how you live. When the serpent whispers his ancient lies about your worth, your purpose, your future, you can respond with the same confidence Jesus showed in the wilderness. It is written. The truth about who you are in God's eyes has been established through the cross, and no amount of deception can change that reality. The patterns of accusation, condemnation, and despair that the enemy has used to torment human hearts for generations lose their power when confronted with the finished work of Christ. The serpent may still hiss his threats and wave his accusations, but they're the desperate thrashing of a defeated foe whose head has already been crushed. Consider the beautiful irony of how this victory unfolds in individual lives. The same pride that led to the serpent's original rebellion, the desire to be like God apart from God, is transformed through the gospel into something completely different. Through Christ, we actually do become partakers of the divine nature, but not through rebellion and theft. Instead, we receive it as a gift from the one who became like us so that we could become like him. The knowledge of good and evil that seemed so appealing in Eden is replaced by something infinitely better, the knowledge of God himself. Instead of learning about evil through personal experience, we learn about good through personal relationship. Instead of gaining wisdom through disobedience, we grow in understanding through trust and surrender. Every aspect of the serpent's original deception finds its perfect answer in the gospel. He promised that disobedience would bring freedom, but Christ demonstrates that true freedom comes through loving obedience. He suggested that God was withholding something good, but the cross reveals a love so extravagant that it gave up everything for our sake. He implied that we could find life by grasping for it. But Jesus shows us that real life comes through laying it down. The transformation doesn't stop with individual lives. The victory over the serpent creates communities of people who reflect the character of their Redeemer. Where the enemy's influence brings division, suspicion, and conflict, the Spirit of Christ produces unity, trust, and peace. Where deception once reigned, truth now flourishes. Where death once dominated, life now abounds. This is why understanding the serpent's true identity matters so much for how we engage with the world around us. When you recognize the patterns of that ancient deception operating in cultural movements, political systems, or philosophical trends, you're not just engaging in intellectual analysis, you're participating in spiritual warfare. You're helping to expose lies that have held people captive and pointing them toward the truth that sets them free. The serpent's strategies haven't changed much over the millennia. He still presents himself as an angel of light, still offers knowledge and power and freedom, still suggests that God's ways are restrictive rather than protective. He still uses partial truths to conceal complete lies, still exploits pride and desire to lead people away from their true purpose. But now we can see through these deceptions because we know how the story ends. We've read the final chapter, and the serpent loses. Every apparent victory of darkness is temporary. Every seeming triumph of evil is ultimately serving purposes that its perpetrators never intended. The cosmic chess match continues, but the outcome has already been determined. This perspective transforms how we respond to injustice, suffering, and evil in our world. We don't minimize their reality or pretend they don't matter, but we see them in the context of a larger story where redemption has the final word. We work against darkness not as those who hope they might succeed, but as those who know victory is guaranteed. The serpent's defeat also transforms how we understand our mission in the world. We're not just trying to make life a little better or society a little more fair. We're participating in the ongoing effects of the cosmic victory that was won at Calvary. Every person who discovers freedom from deception, every community that experiences healing from brokenness, every situation where light penetrates darkness, these are all manifestations of the serpent's crushed head. This is why the story of Eden isn't just about the past, it's about the present and the future. The same promise that sustained hope through thousands of years of waiting is still operative today. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead is still available to transform lives, heal relationships, and restore what was broken. But there's one more aspect of this victory that we haven't fully explored, its ultimate and final expression. The serpent's defeat at the cross guaranteed his destruction, but the complete manifestation of that victory is still to come. The cosmic drama that began with rebellion in heaven and continued through deception in Eden will reach its final act when the ancient enemy is permanently banished from the presence of God and his people. The book of Revelation gives us glimpses of this ultimate resolution. The dragon, that ancient serpent called the devil and Satan, will be thrown into the lake of fire, along with all those who chose to follow his rebellion rather than God's redemption. The curse that began in Eden will be fully reversed, and paradise will be restored in even greater glory than was originally lost. This isn't just the end of evil, it's the beginning of a new creation where the very possibility of deception, corruption, and death has been permanently eliminated. The tree of life that was guarded in Eden will be freely accessible. The river of life will flow through the New Jerusalem. The light of God's presence will illuminate everything, making the sun and moon unnecessary. In that renewed creation, every tear will be wiped away, every sorrow will be healed, every wrong will be made right. The serpent's influence will be not just defeated, but completely erased, as if it had never existed. The cosmic battle that has raged for so long will finally be over, and peace will reign forever. But here's what makes this future hope so powerful in the present moment. It's not just something we're waiting for passively. Every time we choose truth over deception, love over hatred, hope over despair, we're bringing elements of that future reality into the present moment. We're demonstrating what the world looks like when the serpent's power is broken and God's kingdom is established. This is the ultimate revelation of the serpent's forbidden history. It's not just a story about ancient events, but a lens through which we can understand all of reality. The cosmic battle between light and darkness, truth and deception, love and hatred plays out in every human heart, every relationship, every community, every nation. Understanding who the serpent really was helps us recognize these battles when we encounter them. Knowing how his head was crushed gives us confidence in the ultimate outcome. Grasping the scope of the victory that was won transforms how we live in the present and what we hope for in the future. The serpent story began with the corruption of perfection, continued through the deception of innocence, and culminated in the defeat of love. But that defeat was so complete, so final, so devastating to the forces of darkness that it guarantees the ultimate triumph of everything good, beautiful, and true. Every person who has ever felt overwhelmed by evil, discouraged by injustice, or defeated by their own failures can find hope in this ancient story. The serpent who seemed so powerful, so clever, so successful, has been revealed as a defeated foe whose doom is sealed. The cosmic rebel who thought he could usurp God's throne has been cast down forever. The forbidden history of the serpent is ultimately a story of forbidden love. Love so profound that it entered the very situation that seemed most hopeless. Love so powerful that it transformed the moment of greatest defeat into the foundation of eternal victory. Love so complete that it guarantees the final triumph of light over darkness. This is why the serpent's true identity had to be revealed. Not to satisfy curiosity or win theological debates, but to demonstrate the scope of what Christ accomplished and the confidence we can have in his ultimate victory. The enemy we face is not some minor adversary or human opponent, but a cosmic rebel of immense power and intelligence. And that enemy has been completely, finally, eternally defeated. The next time you feel the weight of temptation, remember that you're not fighting alone against an undefeated foe. You're standing in the victory of one who has already crushed the serpent's head. The next time you encounter deception, remember that truth has already triumphed over every lie. The next time you face darkness, remember that the light of the world has already shattered every shadow. The serpent's forbidden history is now complete, its mysteries revealed, its outcome assured. What began in rebellion ends in restoration. What started with deception concludes with truth. What commenced with death culminates in eternal life. The cosmic story that seemed to end in tragedy has been revealed as the greatest victory ever won, and we are all invited to participate in its glorious and eternal conclusion.